By the way, Ian has. Tell me about this other book. Well, I want to flog somebody else. Just a second. Once I start you, I know I can't stop you. So
no, I'll stop it.
I want to flog somebody else's. I want to flog somebody else's book.
He's going to be on my show next week.
Johnny Ray, storied by Johnny Whiteside. Called Cry.
He's coming on my radio show next week for 2 hours.
It's the greatest book. It's. I don't know if you care much about that.
What?
I don't know if you care much about Johnny Ray.
I do.
Well, it doesn't matter if you care about Johnny Ray.
He's talking to the audience in general.
But you should care about Johnny Ray.
He knows you care about Johnny.
Absolutely care about Johnny Ray.
Very important, wasn't he?
And now you say there's a reissue of your book, Ian, of one of your books. How many books you got? Like 8 or 9?
10 actually, but Rock
and you know
Odyssey.
I'm a big fan of. By the way, I might add that I sound like I'm a praiser. I should do PR, shouldn't I? Well, you know that this show is exclusively praising because I only have people on that I like. This isn't like a real show where they shove people on you who you don't want to talk to. So Ian, who I've always liked as a person all over the years, I started reading your books that you gave me one. It's just great. They're great.
Oh, The Beckoning Fairground, I think you liked.
And the stuff about Beckoning Fairground, and the stuff about what you were doing, what a lot of us were doing in the 60s when we came to L.A., you were already here, but the rest of us came to L.A., and you're just digging up all these kind of old-timers that you wanted to meet, and you figured...
Oh, the old songwriters.
Old songwriters. Well, and I was looking for old rockers in the 70s. You were looking
I was talking to Shelton Brooks, who wrote Some of These Days, and I was amazed, and in the Darktown Strutters Ball, I was amazed to discover that Shelton Brooks, a black Canadian, was living in L.A. in 1967, and I couldn't believe that somebody had written Some of These Days.
When was that written?
In 1910 for Sophie Tucker. Well, not for her. Her maid said, "Hey, Miss Tucker, I've got a friend of mine, Shelton Brooks, who writes songs," and she heard Some of These Days, and she said, "That's just great for me." And but you see, the thing about those songs,
she does a good Sophie Tucker.
She sounds like Paul McCartney.
I thought that Sophie. I mean, sorry, I thought.
Well, Paul McCartney did a great Sophie Tucker, actually.
Yeah.
I thought that Some of These Days and songs like that, Bill Bailey, Won't You Please Come Home, were folk songs. Who could have written that? Because to actually meet the guy who wrote these songs, and he was so thrilled because nobody came to see him much.
And what's neat about your particular quest is the logic behind it, which you explain in the book, is that I'm in L.A. If anybody wrote a song in the last 60 years, they may be living here, even if they wrote them in New York. And you were right.
Well, it's interesting how L.A. became, somebody once jokingly said, some Eastern pundit said that if you tip America up, as it does get tipped up from time to time, all the strange people fall to the coast, the West Coast, and they end up in L.A.
Mark Twain, actually.
Well, but the great people did, the oddballs. You think in jazz alone, Jelly Roll Morton was here right from 1912, I mean, he lived here then.
Even
Kid
the
Ory,
bebop era.
They
all came out here sooner or later.
Right. R&B began here.
Ornette Coleman.
Yeah. Ornette Coleman, and
Charlie Park.
Charlie Park, of course. Big J. McNeely. So some of the great things that I loved about America, some of the great sounds, some of the great people, I discovered were in L.A. They were, and nobody was interested much. And so it was great to meet. It was just as much a thrill, by the way, to meet Big J. McNeely as to meet Shelton Brooks, and then to introduce Big J to ragtime was one of the great thrills. He came to my home and he sat there, and I played him a ragtime tape, and he was going. He said, "This is great." I said, "Well, this is Scott Joplin. This is your stuff," and he just got onto it like that. So I love to make those connections.
My greatest coup, in the sense of finding some old guy who nobody'd ever talked to before. Does the name Dudley Brooks ring a bell? I'm very proud of this.
You got me slightly.
Dudley Brooks was a black piano player who had played on virtually every single one of Elvis Presley's Los Angeles recording sessions in the 50s.
Including Jailhouse Rock, right?
Including Jailhouse Rock. And he's in all the sessionographies, but Dudley Brooks, who is this mysteriously Dudley Brooks, he was playing piano in the cocktail lounge at the Huntington Sheraton Hotel in Pasadena.
Wish I'd known
I
that.
tracked him down. Lord knows where he is now. He's an old man. I mean, I hope he's still with us, but I tracked him down about 1980, 81, something like that, living down in South Central. He had been, this is a great story, he'd been working at Paramount Pictures, where they needed a black guy every once in a while for one thing or another musically, and Charles O'Curran, Gail Storm's, not Gail Storm's husband, he was somebody's husband, but he was also a choreographer there, brought Dudley Brooks in. you're a black guy, maybe you understand this Presley person, none of us can figure him out. And he wound up working with Elvis on the movies, but then started doing all the studio stuff at the same time. He's like this jazz piano player who wound up playing on all these Elvis Presley sessions. Never been any pictures of him. Nobody'd ever interviewed him. Nobody'd ever done anything. He was amazed that anybody had ever heard of him.
So he's playing on the Presley Hollywood recordings, the film recordings.
All the soundtracks.
As well
And
as
it's Floyd
all the
Kramer
studio,
on the
all
other
the
ones.
studio stuff from the 50s, and
Right.
in New York it was a guy named Shorty Long.
Really? Well, see, that, well done,
Except
Todd.
Heartbreak Hotel, I think, was Floyd Kramer.
See,
and was New
that's
York.
very interesting. Now, here's something really obscure. I once met in the same district as Shelton Brooks. I met another old black guy who had played the piano. Now, everybody thinks Dooley Wilson played the piano and sang in As Time Goes By. It wasn't. He was just the guy on the
actor,
screen.
yeah.
I met the old guy who was actually playing the, well, it's all obscure.
Wilson sang it, right?
Wilson sang. But I mean, the thing is that it's not obscure, because I think that these people are very important, and that's why I've always looked at songwriters and backing players and all this, because to me they're a very important part.
I'd
of the
much
sound.
rather talk to a songwriter than a performer, generally speaking.
Oh, I quite agree, Todd. Absolutely.
Except, of course, some are both, like Doug here.
Yes.
Or none of the above.
Equally talented in both categories.
Speaking of these turn of the century kind of guys, on White Christmas, now the Spectre album version has a spoken intro that's a whole verse.
Yeah.
Oh,
And
yes,
that
well, I
is
know that.
the original first verse?
That's the
The verse of White Christmas has to do with sitting in Beverly Hills, wondering where all the...
So White Christmas is a
So
song
yeah.
about wishing you were in a snow country
That's
because
right.
you're in
Yeah.
L.A.
But it came from the movie
Holiday
Holiday
Inn.
Inn.
Yeah.
So why did they write that verse for Holiday Inn?
Berlin
That's a good
is
question.
Why did they
They.
write that verse?
What
Because
it-
he's not sitting in
Yeah,
Beverly
he's in
Hills,
Vermont.
he's in Vermont.
No, it's not they, though. Irving
He-
Berlin wrote that.
he,
Well, he
right.
was he was in Beverly Hills when he wrote the song. His daughter calls me constantly.
Okay,
and
so
she
it
told-
wasn't written for that movie.
Well, it went into the film, but it was a one-off which he
Oh.
wrote. He wasn't writing it. It was a
For
part
the-
of a score. or
oh,
anything
okay.
like
Oh, I
that.
see.
Oh,
But
I
you know,
see.
Berlin's very interesting because he's one of my favorites.
And he's
Because-
covered heavily in which of your books?
Well, I wrote
The
a book
Irving
about
Berlin
him.
book.
Irving Berlin, Ragtime America. And his daughter likes the
Funny
book.
how they go together.
Well,
you know?
but you see,
But this
you know,
this is great because, like the Goralnik book that cuts off when Elvis went into the army, his Irving Berlin book cuts off in what, 1917 or something.
well, probably
After that, it was downhill
I
from
think
there.
when it was uphill to downhill. You see, I maintain that
Right,
when
yeah.
people become a success, it's no longer interesting. They just talk about who the big stars they knew, and they went and saw Fred Astaire. And whenever Fred Astaire's name comes in, I go to sleep.
But there's an
because
interesting
isn't
thing
it
about
wonderful? So
that though. It's very few writers or artists can continue to grow as artists. Personally, they may go. You may be right. But there are very few people you can think of that continued to do great
Because the
work
creative
after they
juices go.
became
Yeah.
huge.
You've got to
You know,
fight.
How
you
long
can
did
think
Berlin
of a
go
couple
with
of
really
people.
pumping out hits? To like 40s?
Well, to me, oh yeah, he was writing
I mean,
hits in
past
the
the
50s.
40s?
No, he was still
Yeah,
writing
yeah,
hits.
and
What was the
great
50s?
and great.
He
songs.
wrote Count Your Blessings in the 50s. He wrote Call Me Madam, 1950, I think that came
Call
out.
Me
So-
Madam was probably his last
Yeah, probably
show
his last-
of any
You know,
consequence.
well, what was really sad was Mr. President. You know, he was. I mean, what is sad about this was that the rock and roll, which we all love, came in, and you know, none of these were writers. Richard Rodgers, Irving Berlin could understand, and he has a song called "The Washington Twist" that he put into Call Me into Mr. President. And you know, poor old Richard Rodgers. You know, it's in a book. He was sat down in 1967 in a studio by Clive Davis and said, "You've got to hear. Listen, if you want to write hits, you got to hear rock and roll." And he made him hear the Grateful Dead or something like that. And Richard Rodgers was going, "No, I can't stand it."
Well,
Which gets us back to.
which gets us back to leaving.
Ah, man, what
What?
a great show.
Yeah,
Todd's just arrived.
I know. What are you going to do? We got to leave. It's
I
been
never
a half
did tell
hour.
my
Went like
Sophie
that.
Tucker. I didn't tell my Sophie Tucker story.
Next time.